What if I told you that some of history's greatest secrets, answers to mysteries that have puzzled scholars for centuries, might still be out there, not buried in the ground or hidden in some forgotten tomb, but lost to time, vanished from the pages of history itself? Ancient historians, the very people who chronicled the rise and fall of empires, often spoke of documents so profound, so revealing, that their disappearance has left gaping holes in our understanding of the past. These weren't just scrolls or records, they were keys to unlocking truths about legendary figures, pivotal events, and even the origins of civilizations. And today, we're going to explore 30 of these lost texts, each one a tantalizing glimpse into what could have been. Think about it, entire libraries have crumbled to dust, wars have erased countless writings, and the passage of time has swallowed works that might have changed how we see the ancient world. The historian Livy wrote of early Roman histories that are now gone. The Greek scholar Strabo described maps and accounts of distant lands that vanished without a trace. Even the great library of Alexandria, that beacon of ancient knowledge, held texts whose contents we can only guess at. These weren't just books, they were pieces of the human story, and their absence leaves us forever wondering what we've lost. But here's the thrilling part: the echoes of these documents still remain. Ancient writers mentioned them, quoted them, sometimes even lamented their loss. And that means we have clues, fragments of information that let us reconstruct, at least in part, what might have been inside. Imagine uncovering a letter from Cleopatra that reveals her true strategies, or finding the original chronicles of Atlantis as described by Plato. These aren't just fantasies, they're real possibilities, real mysteries waiting to be solved. So join me as we dive into the shadows of history, piecing together the stories of 30 lost documents that could rewrite everything we thought we knew. The past is calling, and it has secrets to share. The Sibylline Books weren't just any ancient text, they were Rome's secret weapon, a divine cheat sheet consulted in moments of existential crisis. According to legend, the story begins with an old woman approaching King Tarquinius Superbus, the last ruler of Rome before the Republic. She offered him 9 books of prophetic verses at an exorbitant price. When he refused, she burned 3 and offered the remaining 6 at the same cost. He laughed and declined again. She burned 3 more and calmly repeated her demand for the final trio. This time, shaken by her conviction, Tarquin relented, and so Rome acquired what would become its most sacred oracle, words supposedly channeled by the Cumean Sibyl, a prophetess who bridged the mortal and divine. Housed deep within the temple of Jupiter on Rome's Capitoline Hill, these scrolls weren't for public reading. A special priesthood guarded them, interpreting their cryptic verses only when the Senate demanded guidance. Natural disasters, military defeats, strange omens, all prompted solemn consultations of the Sibylline Books. Their advice often led to radical actions, the introduction of new gods like Apollo, elaborate purification rituals, even the construction of entire temples to appease the heavens. They weren't merely religious texts, they were Rome's emergency protocol, a hotline to the gods when all else failed. But here's where history takes a tragic turn. In 83 BC, flames consumed the temple of Jupiter, reducing the original Sibylline Books to ash. The Romans desperately tried to reconstruct them, sending envoys across the Mediterranean to collect replacement prophecies. Yet scholars agree these later copies lacked the authority of the originals. Imagine losing Shakespeare's first folios and trying to recreate them from second-hand summaries. That's the scale of the loss, what makes their disappearance so agonizing for historians. These books potentially contained not just temple rituals, but eyewitness-level accounts of Rome's earliest days, details now lost forever. Some fragments survived in later Roman writings, hinting at apocalyptic visions, cryptic warnings about civil wars, even predictions of Rome's eventual fall. Were these actual prophecies preserved from the originals or later inventions? We may never know. The true Sibylline books died in that fire, taking with them secrets that might have rewritten our understanding of how Rome saw its own destiny. Their absence leaves us with an irresistible question. What world-shaking knowledge went up in smoke that day? Moving beyond Rome's prophetic treasure, another vanished text holds equal fascination, one that supposedly chronicled a civilization swallowed by the sea. Among the most devastating losses in ancient military history must be the complete Annals of Thutmose III, the Napoleon of Egypt whose conquests stretched the empire further than any pharaoh before him. While we know the broad strokes of his reign from temple inscriptions, the original day-by-day chronicles kept by royal scribes referenced tantalizingly in later texts have vanished completely. Imagine finding Julius Caesar's personal campaign journals or Alexander the Great's unfiltered battlefield reports. That's the scale of what's missing here. The fragments we do have paint an extraordinary picture. Carved on temple walls at Karnak, partial accounts describe Thutmose's daring tactics during the Battle of Megiddo, where he surprised enemy forces by taking a narrow mountain pass they deemed impassable. But these inscriptions are like reading a highlight reel suggesting a far more detailed original text existed. One surviving line references the daily records as their source, hinting at meticulous documentation now lost. What else might those pages have contained? First-hand descriptions of troop movements, candid assessments of enemy leaders, even the pharaoh's own unvarnished thoughts as he forged an empire stretching from Nubia to the Euphrates. Consider what we're missing about military innovation alone. Thutmose revolutionized ancient warfare with new siege techniques and supply systems that later empires would copy. His annals likely held technical details, how he transported ships overland to surprise coastal cities, or coordinated the first recorded use of composite bows at scale. Even more intriguing are the political insights lost. Later historians mention the annals recording vassal treaties and diplomatic correspondence, offering a masterclass in how Egypt maintained dominance for centuries. The surviving fragments show Thutmose carefully balancing brutality with mercy, executing rebellious leaders while rewarding loyalty with lavish gifts. But without the full text, we're left guessing at his broader strategy. Perhaps most haunting is what the annals could reveal about cultural exchange. Thutmose's campaigns brought Egyptian advisors to foreign courts and foreign artisans to Egyptian cities. One broken tablet references strange gods being studied by royal priests. Was this an early account of comparative religion? The complete annals might have shown us how conquest shaped not just borders but ideas. Their absence means we'll never know the full story behind Egypt's golden age, leaving historians to piece together a puzzle with half the pieces missing. The tragedy isn't just what was recorded, it's realizing how much more there must have been. The Bronze Tablets of Sparta present one of history's most frustrating enigmas, because what little we know suggests they held the true blueprint for one of the ancient world's most radical societies. Plutarch, writing centuries later, drops tantalizing hints about these metal plaques inscribed with the laws of Lycurgus, the legendary lawgiver who transformed Sparta into a militarized utopia. Unlike fragile papyrus or parchment, bronze should have endured. So why have none survived? Their absence leaves us guessing at the fine print behind Sparta's brutal efficiency, the unedited rules that turned ordinary Greeks into history's most feared warriors. Consider what might have been etched into those metal sheets. Plutarch claims Lycurgus's laws covered everything from child rearing to property rights, all designed to forge absolute loyalty to the state. Take the notorious Agoge, Sparta's state-run child military training. Later sources describe boys taken from their mothers at age 7, subjected to hunger, theft, and ritual beatings to harden them. But the bronze tablets likely specified the exact stages of this brutal curriculum, how often they trained, what they ate, even the precise punishments for showing weakness. Without them, we rely on second-hand accounts filtered through Athenian writers who despised Sparta. Imagine finding an unedited drill manual from the original Spartan generals instead of hearsay from their enemies. Then there's the great mystery of Spartan governance. Most Greek city-states had some form of democracy or tyranny, but Sparta invented something entirely different, a dual kingship with a council of elders and an assembly that shouted votes. The tablets supposedly detailed how this system balanced power to prevent corruption. Some scholars speculate they even contained clauses now lost to history, perhaps term limits for officials or secret rituals to test a king's fitness to rule. The fragments we have are like seeing the cover of a revolutionary political manifesto without being able to read the pages inside. But the real tragedy is how much these tablets could reveal about everyday Spartan life. Later historians mention Lycurgus banning gold and silver currency, but what were the actual penalties for hoarding wealth? The tablets might have recorded the exact rations of black broth fed to soldiers, or the protocols for the Crypteia, the secret police force tasked with culling rebellious helots. Even Sparta's notorious gender norms, where women trained in athletics and managed estates while men were at war, could have been spelled out in those lost inscriptions. Were these strict laws or cultural suggestions? We'll never know for certain. The greatest irony, Sparta's entire system was built on secrecy. Citizens were discouraged from writing anything down, relying instead on oral tradition. That makes the bronze tablets an exception, a rare moment when Sparta's rulers seemingly wanted their laws preserved permanently. Did they regret it? Some historians wonder if the tablets were deliberately destroyed during Rome's conquest of Greece, their radical ideas too dangerous to leave intact. Others believe they still lie buried in the ruins of a Spartan shrine, waiting to rewrite our understanding of how a tiny city-state dominated Greece for centuries. Until then, the bronze tablets remain the missing operating manual for history's most extreme social experiment. Shifting from Sparta's lost laws, another vanished document takes us further east to a kingdom where royal intrigue and espionage were woven into the very fabric of government. The Phoenicians were the masters of the ancient seas, traders, explorers, and navigators whose ships connected empires from the shores of Lebanon to the tin mines of Britain. But what if their greatest achievement wasn't just the routes they sailed, but the records they kept? Ancient sources like Strabo and Pliny the Elder speak of detailed maritime logs, meticulous accounts of winds, currents, and coastlines that guided Phoenician vessels across thousands of miles. These weren't just maps, they were the ancient equivalent of GPS data, compiled over generations by sailors who ventured farther than any civilization before them. And yet, not a single original log survives. Their disappearance isn't just a loss for history, it's a missing chapter in humanity's understanding of early exploration. Picture what those logs might have contained. Greek historians describe Phoenician ships reaching as far as Cornwall for tin and West Africa for gold. Some texts even hint at voyages beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, into the uncharted Atlantic. One fragment from Strabo mentions a log entry detailing a land of eternal mist, possibly referencing the foggy coasts of northern Europe. Another speaks of tides so extreme they could strand ships for days, a phenomenon well known in the Bay of Biscay but alien to Mediterranean sailors. These weren't myths, they were first-hand observations, the kind of practical knowledge that could only come from someone who'd been there. Without the original logs, we're left guessing how much of the ancient world the Phoenicians truly knew. What makes their absence so maddening is the potential clues they held about transatlantic contact. The Greek writer Diodorus Siculus recounts a Phoenician ship blown off course to a distant land with lush forests and navigable rivers, a description some argue could fit the eastern coast of the Americas. But was this a real account from a lost log or just a tall tale? The logs themselves would have settled the debate. They might have contained star charts for unfamiliar skies, sketches of foreign wildlife, even records of encounters with distant cultures. Instead, we're left with tantalizing hints and endless speculation. The tragedy deepens when you consider how these logs were lost. Carthage, the greatest Phoenician colony, had a vast library of maritime knowledge. When Rome burned the city to the ground in 146 B.C., countless scrolls, including what might have been the master copies of centuries of navigational data, went up in flames. Later sailors, from the Greeks to the Vikings, likely relied on Phoenician knowledge without even realizing it, passed down through fragmented copies or oral tradition. Had those logs survived, they might have rewritten our entire timeline of exploration, proving just how far ancient sailors could go with nothing but stars, courage, and a keen eye for the sea's secrets. Now let's turn to a very different kind of lost document, one that held not the wisdom of sailors, but the whispered intrigues of kings and spies. Long before Homer's Odyssey became the definitive tale of a hero's journey home, another version existed attributed to the shadowy figure of Musaeus, a poet so ancient even the Greeks debated whether he was man or myth. Pausanias, writing in the 2nd century AD, drops tantalizing hints about this alternate Odyssey, calling it older and stranger than Homer's version, with scenes that would make even Odysseus blanch. But not a single line survives intact. What we're missing isn't just another epic, it's a window into how myths evolve before they're set in stone. Think of it like uncovering a first draft of Shakespeare's Hamlet where Ophelia wields a dagger instead of flowers. Later writers describe Musaeus's version as darker, more supernatural. Where Homer's sirens lure sailors with song, Musaeus allegedly gave them claws and serpentine tails. Circe wasn't just a sorceress in his telling. She presided over an island of chained monsters, each one a failed experiment in transformation. Even the famous Cyclops scene reportedly differed, with Polyphemus keeping a grotesque shrine of previous victims. These weren't just cosmetic changes, they suggest an earlier, rawer tradition where the line between hero and monster blurred constantly. The loss hits hardest when we consider oral storytelling's fluid nature. Homer's version triumphed precisely because it was written down, freezing one iteration of a tale that had mutated for generations. Musaeus's Odyssey represents a fork in that evolutionary tree, proof that there wasn't one true version, but countless variations competing for attention. Imagine finding Aesop's original fables before they were sanitized for children. That's the level of cultural distortion we're dealing with. Without Musaeus, we'll never know how much Homer polished or omitted to suit his audience. What fascinates scholars most are the fragments hinting at lost theological depths. A Byzantine scholar quotes Musaeus describing Odysseus consulting the dead not in Hades, but in a cavern where the sky hangs like a black sail, a detail Homer streamlined out. Another reference suggests Penelope had visions foretelling her husband's return, making her less a passive loyal wife and more an active participant in divine schemes. These nuances matter because they show early Greek religion as a living, breathing thing, not the tidy pantheon later poets would codify, the cruelest irony. Musaeus was said to be Orpheus's son, linking his Odyssey to the mystical traditions that birthed Greek drama and philosophy. Had it survived, we might trace a direct line from monster-filled epics to Plato's dialogues. Instead, we're left with whispers of a world where heroes walked closer to the edge of madness, and homecoming wasn't guaranteed, just one more ghost story swallowed by time. The Chronicles of the Chaldeans stand as one of history's most frustrating gaps, a Babylonian masterwork cited by ancient historians like Berossus and Josephus, yet lost to us entirely. Imagine holding a single torn page from a book that supposedly spanned everything from the dawn of creation to Alexander the Great's conquests. That's the scale of what's missing here. Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing for Greek audiences around 280 B.C., claimed to draw from these chronicles, an unbroken record kept by temple scribes for millennia. If he was telling the truth, their disappearance isn't just the loss of a text, it's the erasure of Mesopotamia's voice from its own story. consider what these chronicles could have clarified. The Babylonian creation myth, Enuma Elish, survives in fragments, but Berosus hints that the original chronicles contained alternate versions, including a genealogy of antediluvian kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years. Were these purely mythical figures or distorted memories of real dynasties? Josephus, quoting the same source, mentions a detailed account of the Tower of Babel's construction, complete with engineering specifics lost in the biblical version. These weren't just stories, they were technical and theological records from a civilization that saw no divide between the two. The real tragedy lies in the chronicles' potential to solve chronological puzzles. Babylonian king lists often conflict with gaps that force historians to guess at entire reigns. Berosus references the chronicles meticulously tracking eclipses, floods, and even market prices data that could have anchored Mesopotamian history to precise dates. One tantalizing fragment describes a great darkness lasting 3 days, possibly referencing the same solar eclipse we've dated to 763 B. See, had the full text survived, we might have a Rosetta Stone for aligning Babylonian, Egyptian, and Hebrew timelines, but perhaps the most heartbreaking loss is the human perspective. Unlike the impersonal carvings on monuments, temple chronicles supposedly included everything from royal decrees to scribes' marginal notes like a Twitter feed from antiquity. One surviving quote via Josephus describes Nebuchadnezzar's madness with startling intimacy. He walked as a beast, his nails like talons whispering to the moon. This wasn't dry historiography, it was raw, psychological portraiture. How many other rulers were depicted with such unvarnished honesty? The chronicle's fate remains a mystery. Some argue they burned when Alexander's troops sacked Babylon. Others believe they were still intact in Rome's imperial archives before fading into obscurity. What's certain is that their absence forces us to reconstruct Mesopotamia through second-hand accounts and broken tablets, like trying to understand a symphony by hearing only every third note. The echoes are beautiful, but the full composition is forever out of reach. Turning from Babylon's lost history, another vanished text offers a very different temptation. Not a record of kings and floods, but a guide to the afterlife so powerful, its mere possession was said to be deadly. The books of Kings in the Bible contain a frustratingly brief phrase that has haunted historians for centuries. Now the rest of the acts of King X and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah? This tantalizing reference, repeated for nearly every ruler, points to an entire library of lost documents, the meticulously kept royal and temple archives of pre-exilic Jerusalem. These weren't just administrative records, they were the raw material of early Israelite history, composed by eyewitness scribes who walked the corridors of power centuries before the Bible took its final form. Their disappearance isn't merely the loss of ancient paperwork, it's the silencing of Jerusalem's own voice during its most formative era. Imagine holding the original court diaries from King David's reign. The Bible presents his story through a theological lens, but those annals would have shown us the unvarnished politics, how a shepherd turned warlord actually consolidated power. One cryptic reference in 1 Kings 11 suggests the chronicles recorded Solomon's administrative districts in granular detail, including forced labor quotas that the biblical authors soften. Other passages hint at military reports omitted from scripture, like King Jehoshaphat's naval expeditions that ended in disaster. These weren't dry ledgers, they were the rough draft of a nation's memory, preserving triumphs and failures alike before later editors reshaped them into sacred narrative. The temple archives offer even more tantalizing possibilities. 2 Chronicles mentions records kept by Levitical singers, musical notations for psalms we now only know as lyrics. Did David's lament for Saul and Jonathan originally have a melody? We'll never hear it. Then there's the matter of early prophecy. Jeremiah's scribe Baruch references reading from a scroll containing all the words of Adonai in the temple, suggesting collections of oracles predating the canonical prophets. Some scholars speculate these could have included the visions of female seers like Huldah, whose full prophecies are reduced to just a few lines in scripture. What makes this loss devastating is how it skews our understanding of Israelite religion. The surviving Hebrew Bible went through extensive editing during the Babylonian exile, centuries after many of these events occurred. The pre-exilic annals would have shown us Yahweh worship before centralization, when local shrines still operated, and the Jerusalem temple was just one holy site among many. A single reference in 2 Kings describes King Hezekiah removing a bronze serpent venerated since Moses' time, proving even objects with deep religious heritage were purged during reforms. How many other practices were erased from history when those archives burned? The cruelest twist, we know exactly when most were destroyed, in 586 B.C. Nebuchadnezzar's army torched Jerusalem, deliberately targeting the temple and palace where these records were stored. A few scrolls may have survived. The books of Kings were likely compiled from salvaged fragments, but the vast majority vanished in that fire. For biblical scholars, it's like trying to reconstruct Shakespeare's plays using only actors' paraphrases. The annals wouldn't just clarify history, they'd reveal how much was rewritten, what stories were left out, and why. Their absence means we're left reading between the lines of Scripture, forever wondering what the first draft of Israel's story truly said. From the ashes of Jerusalem's archives, we turn to a very different kind of lost text, one that didn't record history but promised to change it. Hidden in the vaults of Byzantine emperors, a manual of forbidden knowledge supposedly held the power to topple empires. The Etruscans held the keys to Rome's spiritual origins, literally. Their library rituals, a collection of sacred manuals cited by Roman historians like Cicero and Seneca, weren't just religious texts, they were the DNA of early Roman spirituality, detailing everything from how to read lightning strikes as divine messages to the exact rituals for founding a city. When the Roman general Scipio Africanus sacked the Etruscan city of Veii in 396 B.C., he reportedly carried off these texts as spoils of war, recognizing their power. Yet today, not a single page survives. Their disappearance isn't just the loss of Etruscan culture, it's the silencing of the very voices that taught Rome how to speak to its gods. What made these texts so extraordinary? Roman authors described them as encyclopedic in scope, divided into three sections: the Libri Haruspicini on divination, the Libri Fulgurales on interpreting thunderbolts, and the Libri Rituales governing everything from funerals to city planning. Imagine inheriting an instruction manual from a civilization that believed every bird's flight pattern or liver spot held cosmic significance. The Etruscans didn't just predict the future, they mapped the universe as a grid where gods communicated through natural phenomena. When a Roman priest examined a sacrificed animal's entrails, he wasn't inventing a practice, he was following Etruscan footnotes we can no longer read. The loss hits hardest when we consider Rome's debt to Etruscan cosmology. The Capitoline triad Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva was originally an Etruscan concept. Even the famous Roman sewer system, the Cloaca Maxima, was built following Etruscan ritual prescriptions for purifying spaces. But without the original texts, we're left guessing at the deeper philosophy behind these practices. Fragments preserved by later writers hint at a world where time was divided into secula, ages lasting roughly 110 years, each ending with apocalyptic omens. The Etruscans reportedly knew their civilization had an expiration date. Did they foresee Rome's rise or believe their knowledge would outlast them? Perhaps most tantalizing are the rumors of forbidden techniques. The historian Pliny mentions an Etruscan priest summoning lightning to strike enemies, while Seneca describes rituals to extend a person's lifespan by redistributing years from other family members. Were these misunderstood metaphors or actual esoteric sciences? the library rituals might have contained answers bridging the gap between magic and early physics. Instead, we're left with second-hand accounts filtered through Roman elites who often distorted Etruscan practices to suit their narratives, the cruelest twist. The Etruscans themselves likely saw this coming. Their art frequently depicts prophets with somber expressions, as if mourning knowledge that would one day vanish. And vanish it did, taking with it the chance to understand how much of Rome's grandeur was borrowed and how much was truly earned. What remains are whispers in Latin texts, echoes of a civilization that taught an empire how to listen to the sky, only to have its own voice erased by time. Herodotus once wrote of a Scythian epic so vivid, so essential to their identity, that warriors would recite its verses before battle, a thunderous hymn to Ares, their god of war, unlike anything in Greek or Roman tradition. This was no sanitized Olympian deity, but a bloodthirsty spirit worshipped with sword sacrifices atop mounds of piled brushwood. The historian describes fragments of rituals, how Scythians would pour wine over fallen enemies' skulls in Ares' honor, or keep ancient iron swords erected as idols. But the epic itself, the narrative backbone of these practices, has vanished without a trace. Its absence isn't just a missing poem, it's the silencing of an entire warrior culture's sacred voice. What made this epic so unique? Greek writers treated Ares as little more than a brute, but the Scythians saw their war god as inseparable from the land itself. Herodotus mentions a line about Ares rising from the black earth with a voice like thunder, suggesting their deity was less a personified figure and more a primal force. Later nomadic traditions hint at even wilder elements: shape-shifting wolves, storms that took human form, and oaths sworn on blades rather than altars. Without the full text, we're left trying to reconstruct an entire theology from pottery shards. The real tragedy lies in what the epic could reveal about Scythian identity. These were people who built no cities, left no written records, yet dominated the steppes for centuries. Their epic was their cultural anchor, passed down orally across generations. Imagine discovering that Beowulf wasn't just a story, but a living map of values, teaching everything from battle tactics to how to die well. Fragmentary accounts suggest the Scythian Ares epic did exactly that, weaving together creation myths with practical wisdom. Why you should never sheathe a bloodied sword, or how to interpret the cries of carrion birds as divine messages. Even more intriguing are the whispers of female warriors in the narrative. Greek writers treated Amazon legends as fantasy, but archaeological finds confirm Scythian women fought alongside men. Did the epic contain their stories? A single line in a Byzantine chronicle references the daughters of Ares who drink the moon, possibly describing warrior priestesses. The full text might have rewritten our understanding of gender roles in nomadic societies, proving that the mythical Amazons weren't myths at all, but historical figures celebrated in verse. Why did it disappear? The Scythians themselves may hold the answer. Unlike Mediterranean cultures, they viewed knowledge as something alive, carried on breath and blood rather than parchment. When their civilization faded, their epics didn't burn, they simply stopped being whispered. All we have now are Greek caricatures of barbarian rituals stripped of context. The loss is immeasurable, not just a poem, but the heartbeat of a people who shaped Eurasia's history, reduced to second-hand fragments. Their Ares still waits in the steppe winds, howling for listeners who no longer remember the words. Plato's story of Atlantis begins with a tantalizing disclaimer. This wasn't his invention, but a tale passed down through generations, originating with the Athenian lawgiver Solon. During his travels to Egypt around 590 B.C., priests at Sais allegedly showed Solon ancient records of a mighty civilization beyond the Pillars of Hercules, one that had warred with Athens 9,000 years earlier before sinking beneath the waves in a single cataclysmic day and night. Solon supposedly transcribed these accounts into a manuscript now lost to history, leaving Plato's Timaeus and Critias as our only and heavily filtered windows into what might have been. But here's where the mystery deepens. Plato's dialogues read less like mythology and more like a historian's dossier. Critias describes Atlantis with startling specificity. Concentric rings of land and water, advanced engineering, even the mineral orichalcum, gleaming like fire in the palace walls. These details suggest Solon's original notes weren't vague legends but meticulous records. So why would Egypt's priests preserve such an account? Some scholars propose they were documenting a real maritime power, perhaps the Minoans, whose volcanic collapse at Thera mirrors Plato's timeline. Others argue the story encodes Bronze Age memories of sea peoples who ravaged Mediterranean coasts. Without Solon's manuscript, we're left guessing whether Atlantis was a cautionary tale, a garbled history, or something else entirely. The loss of the Atlantean dialogues doesn't just leave gaps, it spawns endless speculation. Later writers like Crantor claim to have seen columns in Egypt confirming Plato's story, but those too have vanished. Even Plato's own account cuts off mid-sentence as Critias begins detailing Atlantis's legal system, as if the source material abruptly ended. This missing context fuels modern debates. Was Atlantis meant to illustrate philosophical ideals, or did Plato genuinely believe in its existence? The dialogue's disappearance means we'll never know how much was embellished, or what breathtaking details might have been left out. Perhaps most frustrating is what the original texts could reveal about ancient global connections. Solon's notes reportedly described Atlantis controlling lands larger than Libya and Asia combined, a phrase some interpret as evidence of transatlantic contact. Imagine finding a 6th century B.C. Greek manuscript referencing the Americas. That's the scale of what might have been lost. Instead, Atlantis remains a ghost in the historical record, a civilization that may have existed only in the margins of a document we can no longer read, leaving us to wonder whether the ocean's greatest secret still lies buried in some undiscovered cache of Solon's papers. The Persian royal gazettes were the bureaucratic heartbeat of history's first superpower, meticulous records kept by Achaemenid scribes that documented everything from tax receipts to royal proclamations across an empire stretching from the Nile to the Indus. Greek physician Ctesias, who served at the Persian court in the 5th century B.C., later claimed to have consulted these archives while writing his now-lost Persica, teasing modern historians with fragments that suggest just how comprehensive these documents must have been. Unlike the propaganda carved into palace walls at Persepolis, the gazettes likely contained unvarnished truth, logistical reports, provincial grievances, even candid accounts of court intrigue. Their disappearance isn't just the loss of Persian history, it's the silencing of an administrative revolution that laid the groundwork for every empire that followed. What set these records apart was their sheer scale. The Achaemenids didn't just rule, they micromanaged with a bureaucracy so advanced it could track the movement of grain between Babylon and Bactria. Ctesias mentions gazette entries detailing everything from Cyrus the Great's coronation rituals to the exact rations served to workers building Darius's palace. One tantalizing fragment describes a royal decree carved on clay tablets in 3 languages, sent simultaneously to 23 satrapies, an ancient version of a mass email blast. But these weren't dry memos. Later historians quote Ctesias recounting how the gazettes preserved dramatic moments verbatim, like Queen Atossa's whispered warning to Xerxes about Athenian resilience before the disastrous invasion of Greece. Imagine reading the original meeting minutes from history's most fateful decisions. The real tragedy is what these records could reveal about Persian governance. Modern scholars still debate how the Achaemenids maintained control over 50 million people across dozens of cultures. The gazettes likely held the answer, documenting everything from the famous royal roads courier system to the secret network of spies the Greeks called the King's Eyes. Even more intriguing are hints about cultural policy. One surviving note via Ctesias mentions a decree allowing Jewish exiles in Babylon to rebuild their temple, not out of religious tolerance, but because Persian accountants calculated it would reduce unrest in a strategically vital province. This wasn't just administration, it was geopolitical genius encoded in clay tablets. Perhaps most heartbreaking is how selectively these records were preserved. When Alexander burned Persepolis in 330 B.C., most gazettes likely perished in the inferno, yet some may have survived long enough to influence later empires. The Romans reportedly studied Persian administrative methods through secondary sources. Had the original documents endured, we might trace a direct line from Cyrus's ministers to modern civil services. Instead, we're left with ghostly echoes, a receipt for linen shipments here, a fragmentary decree there. The full story of how the ancient world's most efficient bureaucracy operated remains locked in ashes, leaving us to wonder how much wisdom was lost in that fire. Turning from the Persians' meticulous record-keeping, we encounter a stark contrast, a civilization that guarded its secrets so fiercely, even its own citizens were forbidden from writing them down. Long before Apollonius of Rhodes penned his famous Argonautica in the 3rd century B.C., there was another version of Jason's legendary voyage, one so old even the ancient Greeks considered it a relic from their mythical past. Fragments and references point to poets like Eumelus of Corinth, active as early as the 8th century B.C., composing an epic that told the tale with stark differences from the polished version we know today. Imagine discovering Homer's rough draft of the Iliad, where Achilles fights not with honor but with sheer brutality, or where the gods intervene not for justice but out of petty spite. That's the kind of raw, unfiltered storytelling we're missing with this lost Argonautica, a version that might show us Greek heroism before it was sanitized for later audiences. What set this earlier account apart? Later writers like Pausanias drop hints about a Jason who wasn't just a noble leader but a cunning trickster, more pirate than prince. In Eumelus's version, the Golden Fleece wasn't simply hanging in a sacred grove. It was guarded by a sleepless dragon, yes, but also by a tribe of sorcerers who could bend reality itself. Medea, far from being a lovesick accomplice, was rumored to be the true architect of the fleece's theft, using Jason as a pawn in her own power struggles. Even the Argo, that iconic ship, might not have been built by Athena's divine hand but salvaged from the wreckage of an older, darker vessel. These weren't minor tweaks. They were fundamental shifts in how the story functioned, less about glory and more about survival in a world where the line between hero and villain blurred constantly. The loss of this pre-Apollonian Argonautica isn't just about missing adventure scenes. It's about losing a key to understanding how Greek myths evolved. Later versions smooth over contradictions, turning chaotic, morally ambiguous tales into clean narratives of virtue triumphant. But the older fragments suggest a time when heroes didn't always win through bravery alone. Sometimes they lied, cheated, or barely escaped with their lives. One surviving quote attributed to Eumelus describes Jason facing a choice: sacrifice his crew or break an oath to the gods. In Apollonius's version, this moment vanishes entirely. Without the original, we can't see the rough edges that later poets filed away. The parts of the story that might have made Jason less a role model and more a desperate man clinging to survival. Perhaps the most tantalizing gap is the religious context later versions stripped out. Early references hint that the fleece wasn't just a trophy but a sacred object with ties to human sacrifice, a relic from an era when gods demanded blood, not just prayers. The ship's voyage might have mirrored actual initiation rites, where young men faced symbolic death and rebirth. But as Greek culture shifted, these darker elements were scrubbed clean, leaving behind an adventure yarn stripped of its original spiritual weight. The true tragedy: we'll never know how much of the Argonautica began as liturgy before it became literature. What remains are echoes, a phrase here, a contradictory account there, suggesting a story far richer and stranger than the one that survived. The original Argonautica wasn't just another epic, it was a window into the Greek imagination before it was tamed by philosophy and empire. Its disappearance means we're left with the aftermath of a cultural revolution, forever wondering what was lost when myths were rewritten to fit a new, more polished world. The Carthaginian explorer Hanno didn't just sail along the coast of Africa, he might have rewritten the map of the ancient world around 500 BC. This admiral embarked on a voyage so ambitious, his logbook became legendary. Greek geographers like Pliny the Elder and Arrian reference Hanno's Periplus, a detailed chronicle of his journey beyond the Pillars of Hercules down the West African shoreline. But the original document vanished, leaving us with a tantalizing paradox. Second-hand accounts describe lands of erupting volcanoes, gorillas mistaken for hairy people, and rivers teeming with crocodiles, details so precise they suggest Carthaginian sails may have brushed the equator. Yet without Hanno's own words, we're left piecing together a puzzle with half the pieces missing. What makes this loss so agonizing is how it obscures Carthage's true maritime prowess. The Greek version of Hanno's Periplus, likely a condensed translation, describes anchoring at a place called Cerne, possibly modern-day Essaouira in Morocco, where settlers traded with locals for ivory and animal skins. But the original Carthaginian text almost certainly contained navigational gold, star charts for unfamiliar southern skies, tidal patterns for treacherous currents, even sketches of coastlines that wouldn't be mapped again for centuries. One fragment mentions a mountain of fire visible at night, possibly Mount Cameroon, active during Hanno's era. If accurate, this would mean Carthaginian ships ventured over 2,000 miles south of Gibraltar, centuries before any Mediterranean power dared such a journey. The Periplus wasn't just a travelogue, it was a trade manifesto. Carthage guarded its maritime knowledge like state secrets, falsifying maps to mislead competitors. Hanno's original log likely contained coded directions to gold-rich regions or routes bypassing hostile tribes. Later writers hint at censored passages, perhaps references to trans-Saharan trade networks or even speculative voyages toward the Americas. A single line in Pliny suggests Hanno encountered islands beyond the sunset, a phrase that's fueled theories about Carthaginian contact with the Canaries or Azores. But without the source material, we can't separate fact from Phoenician propaganda. The document's disappearance is a historical crime scene. Some scholars blame Rome's destruction of Carthage in 146 BC, when libraries burned for 17 days. Others suspect Christian or Islamic authorities purged pagan texts in later centuries. Whatever the cause, the loss is immeasurable. Hanno's Periplus could have shown us how an ancient civilization viewed lands beyond its imagination, not as voids on a map but as realms of possibility. Instead, we're left with whispers of a voyage that might have changed how we see the ancient world, if only the waves hadn't swallowed its story. From the ashes of Carthage's maritime records, another lost text beckons, one that didn't chart coastlines but the contours of the human soul. Aristotle might have shaped Western philosophy, but he was standing on the shoulders of giants whose words we've never read. The scrolls of Thales, Anaximander, and other pre-Socratic thinkers, cited constantly in ancient texts as the founders of rational inquiry, have vanished completely. What survives are mere paraphrases, like trying to reconstruct Shakespeare from someone's half-remembered theater review. These weren't just lost books. They were the blueprints for how humanity first dared to explain the universe without invoking gods. Take Thales of Miletus, often called the first philosopher. Aristotle credits him with proposing that water was the fundamental substance of all things, but we only have that single line stripped of context. Did Thales arrive at this idea through observations of Nile floods or some deeper reasoning about transformation? Later writers mention his lost treatise on the solstice, suggesting he calculated celestial events with startling precision. Yet without the original, we can't tell if his methods were genius or guesswork. Even more frustrating are hints that Thales wrote about magnetism and static electricity, describing how amber attracted feathers when rubbed. Had those scrolls survived, they might have rewritten the timeline of scientific discovery by centuries. Anaximander's case is even more tantalizing. Known for theorizing an infinite, boundless reality he called the Aperon, his original text allegedly contained something radical, the first known attempt at a cosmological diagram. Imagine holding a map of the universe drawn in the 6th century B.C., showing Earth floating unsupported in space with celestial bodies moving in perfect rings. Later philosophers describe it in awe, but their accounts conflict. Some say he depicted the stars as fiery wheels, others as holes in a vast canopy. The diagram itself is gone, leaving us to wonder whether Anaximander envisioned a universe far more sophisticated than we've credited him for. The real tragedy lies in how these losses distort intellectual history. When Heraclitus declared you can't step in the same river twice, was he arguing for constant change or making a deeper point about identity? Without his original on nature, we're left with out-of-context soundbites that later philosophers reinterpreted to fit their own agendas. The same applies to Parmenides' poem on reality, which supposedly laid out his radical view that change is an illusion. Only 160 lines survive, yet Roman writers reference sections where he described reality as a perfect, unchanging sphere, an idea that inspired Plato's theory of forms. How many other philosophical revolutions began in passages we'll never read? Perhaps most heartbreaking is what these scrolls could reveal about cross-cultural exchange. Thales reportedly studied geometry in Egypt, while Anaximander's ideas about infinite worlds echo Persian and Indian cosmologies. Were these connections explored in their lost works? A single surviving fragment from Xenophanes mocks the Greek habit of depicting gods as human-shaped, suggesting deities might look entirely different to Ethiopians or Scythians. This wasn't just theology, it was early anthropology, evidence that Greek philosophy didn't emerge in isolation but through conversations stretching from the Ganges to the Nile. The pre-Socratics' disappearance isn't merely a gap in philosophy. It's a missing link in humanity's greatest intellectual adventure, the moment we stopped explaining the world through myths and began crafting theories that could be questioned, tested, and refined. What we have are shadows on the cave wall. The objects casting them are lost to time. The Mauryan Emperor Ashoka carved his conscience into stone, literal pillars of remorse and reform erected across the subcontinent after his bloody conquest of Kalinga. But what if those famous edicts we see today are just the tip of the iceberg? Sri Lanka's ancient chronicles, like the Mahavamsa, whisper of other proclamations, edicts now lost that might hold the key to understanding how Buddhism transformed from a local sect to a global faith. These weren't just royal decrees, they were diplomatic masterstrokes sent to kingdoms as far away as Syria and Egypt, weaving a web of spiritual influence that stretched farther than historians ever imagined. Picture the scene: Ashoka's court scribes drafting letters on palm leaves or silk, destined for the courts of Antiochus Roman II in Syria and Ptolemy Roman II in Egypt. The Mahavamsa describes these texts in tantalizing fragments. One supposedly assured foreign rulers that conquest through Dharma was superior to military might. Another invited them to send scholars to study in Patalipatra. But here's what's haunting. While Ashoka's pillar edicts survived because they were etched in stone, these delicate diplomatic missives decayed or were destroyed. Their absence leaves us guessing at the soft power strategies behind history's first Buddhist evangelism. Were there promises of trade incentives for rulers who embraced nonviolence? Secret alliances sealed through shared spiritual values. Even more intriguing are the hints about Buddhism's southeastward spread. The Dipavamsa, another Sri Lankan chronicle, mentions edicts sent to Suvarnabhumi, likely modern-day Myanmar or Thailand, long before traditional timelines acknowledge Mauryan contact there. One cryptic passage suggests Ashoka dispatched relics alongside these texts, turning diplomacy into sacred theater. Imagine a royal envoy presenting not just a scroll, but a vessel said to hold the Buddha's ashes, with instructions to enshrine it as the heart of a new city. Without the original edicts, we can't confirm whether these missions were religious outreach or geopolitical chess moves, or both. The real tragedy lies in the social details these lost edicts might have contained. Ashoka's known inscriptions praise tolerance, but Sri Lankan sources imply others went further, perhaps outlining concrete policies for supporting non-Buddhist ascetics or mediating between rival sects. One fragment in the Mahavamsa describes an edict establishing hospitals for animals, a radical idea even by modern standards. Did Ashoka's bureaucrats keep copies in imperial archives? If so, they vanished when the Mauryan dynasty fell, taking with them the chance to hear one of antiquity's most visionary rulers speak not to his subjects but to the wider world. What remains are echoes, a Greek ambassador's passing reference to letters from India in Seleucid archives, a Chinese pilgrim's 7th century A.D. account of Ashoka's texts preserved in Gandhara. Like shadows on a cave wall, they hint at a diplomatic revolution we can barely reconstruct. The pillar edicts show us Ashoka the penitent king, but the lost scrolls would have revealed Ashoka the global strategist, a man who understood that ideas could travel farther than armies and that true conquest began in the mind. Their disappearance means we're left with half a conversation, forever wondering how a 3rd century B.C. emperor whispered his vision across continents and how the world whispered back. The Druids didn't just memorize songs, they held entire universes in their minds. Roman historian Posidonius, traveling through Gaul in the 1st century B.C., described bards who could recite genealogies stretching back centuries, epic poems lasting days, and legal codes so precise they governed everything from property disputes to royal successions. These weren't mere entertainers, they were living libraries of Celtic culture, trained for 20 years in dark forests to perfect their craft. Yet today, not a single line of their original verses survives. The systematic Roman suppression of Druidism didn't just erase a religion, it silenced an entire civilization's way of seeing itself. What made these oral histories so revolutionary was their fluid precision. Unlike rigid Roman records, Celtic bards reportedly wove facts into ever-evolving narratives, adjusting details to fit new context while preserving core truths. Julius Caesar himself noted with begrudging respect how Gaulish warriors would pause battles to hear bards recount ancestral victories, as if the past itself were fighting alongside them. One fragment from Posidonius mentions a bard tracing a chieftain's lineage through 30 generations, linking him to mythical founders who emerged from sacred groves. Imagine discovering that Shakespeare's histories were just the latest versions of stories passed down since the Stone Age, constantly reshaped yet always recognizable. The loss cuts deepest when we consider what these genealogies could reveal about pre-Roman Europe. Later Welsh and Irish texts, likely preserving fragments of the oral tradition, hint at a worldview where kingship wasn't inherited but earned through mystical trials. The Mabinogion describes heroes conversing with ancestral spirits in burial mounds, suggesting the bard's chronicles weren't dry lists of names but living dialogues between the present and past. Even more tantalizing are Roman accounts of judgment songs, averse recitals used in legal proceedings where the rhythm itself supposedly revealed hidden truths. Without these original performances, we've lost not just stories, but an entire jurisprudence encoded in poetry. Perhaps most devastating is how deliberately this knowledge was erased. After the Roman conquest of Gaul, Augustus banned Druidic practices entirely, seeing their influence as a threat to imperial control. Sacred groves were burned, and with them, the training grounds where bardic knowledge was transmitted. What fragments survived did so in Christianized forms, like the Irish Leber Gabala Eren, where pagan gods were recast as ancient kings. the original verses, with their unfiltered depictions of shape-shifting deities, sacred marriages to the land, and rituals tied to solstice alignments, vanished forever. Yet echoes linger. Medieval Welsh poems occasionally burst with imagery so vivid, descriptions of trees that whisper prophecies, or rivers that flow with ancestral memory, that scholars suspect Druidic roots. And in Brittany, folklorists recorded ballads in the 19th century that still followed the intricate meter systems Posidonius described. These aren't just fading traditions, they're the last whispers of a once thriving oral civilization that saw history not as dates on parchment, but as living breath between generations. The bards may be gone, but their ghosts still hum in the wind through standing stones, waiting for someone to remember the old tunes. Turning from the whispered remnants of Celtic Europe, another lost text takes us across the Mediterranean, where an inventor's dreams literally went up in smoke. The Minoan civilization flourished on Crete over 3,000 years ago, leaving behind grand palaces, vivid frescoes, and a script that still defies translation. Linear A, unlike its later cousin, Linear B, which was cracked in the 1950s to reveal an early form of Greek, Linear A remains a tantalizing enigma. Hundreds of these clay tablets survive, covered in symbols that look almost familiar yet stubbornly refuse to give up their secrets. What makes this silence so frustrating is that these aren't just shopping lists or tax records, though they might include those, but possibly the only first-hand accounts of Europe's first advanced civilization. Without them, the Minoans are like a play where we can see the actors but never hear their lines. Archaeologists have pieced together some clues from context alone. Most Linear A tablets come from palace storerooms, suggesting they tracked goods like olive oil, wine, and textiles, essential commodities in a trade empire that stretched from Egypt to Sardinia. The symbols include numerals and pictograms of jars, grain, and livestock, hinting at a bureaucratic system as sophisticated as anything in Mesopotamia. But here's where it gets intriguing. A few tablets were found in peak sanctuaries high in Crete's mountains, covered in symbols unlike the administrative ones. These might record religious offerings or even hymns to the Minoan gods, perhaps the very words chanted during bull-leaping ceremonies depicted in those famous frescoes. Imagine holding a prayer to the Earthshaker, the deity who supposedly sent quakes to topple Minoan cities, only to stare at symbols we can't read. The stakes of decipherment go far beyond filling museum labels. Linear A could rewrite our understanding of pre-Greek Europe. Some scholars believe it encodes a lost language unrelated to any known family, a linguistic isolate spoken only on Bronze Age Crete. Others argue it's an early form of Luwian, linking the Minoans to Anatolia's sprawling Hittite empire. A single deciphered tablet might settle this debate, revealing whether Crete was a cultural bridge or a solitary marvel. Even more tantalizing are the hints of loanwords in Linear B terms for spices, textiles, and gods that might be borrowed from Minoan. These linguistic ghosts suggest a rich vocabulary for concepts the Mycenaean Greeks had no words for, like the vibrant dyes that made Cretan textiles legendary or the hallucinogenic plants possibly used in religious rites. What's equally fascinating is what Linear A's structure reveals about Minoan thought. Unlike Linear B's rigid syllabic grid, Linear A has more fluid symbol combinations, leading some linguists to propose it was a mixed script, part logographic, part phonetic, akin to Egyptian hieroglyphs. This complexity might explain why it resists decoding, but it also implies a nuanced way of recording ideas, where a single symbol could convey a concept and a sound simultaneously. For example, a jar symbol might mean wine in one context and the syllable y in another. That kind of flexibility suggests a society comfortable with ambiguity, where writing wasn't just for accounting but for poetry, law, and maybe even philosophy. The greatest tragedy is that we may never crack it, unlike the Rosetta Stone, which handed scholars a Greek key to Egyptian hieroglyphs. No bilingual Linear A inscription has been found. The Minoans themselves may have deliberately kept their script opaque, a sacred or elite code never meant for outsiders. Or perhaps the answer lies in a still undiscovered archive, buried under volcanic ash or sunk in a shipwreck. Until then, these silent tablets hold the untold stories of a civilization that built labyrinths, painted dolphins leaping through azure waves, and then vanished, leaving behind whispers we can't quite hear. From the hushed mystery of Minoan script, we turn to a very different kind of lost document, one that didn't record words but wounds. Manetho should have been the ultimate insider, an Egyptian priest writing in the 3rd century B.C., with full access to temple archives that stretched back to the pyramids. His Egyptiocha was meant to be the authoritative history of Egypt, a sweeping chronicle of dynasties and gods that would make sense of millennia for the Greeks ruling his homeland. Josephus quotes him with reverence. Early Christian scholars leaned on his timelines, and even today, Egyptologists still argue over his king lists. But here's the bitter irony: the original text is almost entirely gone. What remains are fragments quoted in later works, like trying to reconstruct a mosaic from a handful of scattered tiles. And without those missing volumes, we're left guessing at some of ancient Egypt's most fundamental mysteries. Think about what Manetho had at his fingertips: records from Heliopolis and Memphis that could trace pharaonic bloodlines back to the gods themselves. Josephus preserves tantalizing snippets: Manetho's division of rulers into 30 dynasties, his accounts of the Hyksos invaders, even bizarre details like the reign of a king who was a woman disguised as a man. But these are just breadcrumbs. The real treasure would be Manetho's original narratives explaining how power shifted between dynasties, stories that might settle modern debates about whether certain transitions were peaceful successions or bloody coups. One surviving fragment mentions a civil war during the 5th dynasty sparked by a disputed oracle, a detail found nowhere in tomb inscriptions. How many other political dramas were recorded only in those lost pages? What makes Manetho's loss especially painful is how he could have bridged the gap between legend and history. His chronicles reportedly began with the gods ruling Egypt directly before passing authority to semi-divine pharaohs. Later copyists found this so outrageous they likely censored it, but what if Manetho was preserving authentic tradition? Imagine finding his unfiltered account of rulers like Menes, the first human pharaoh. Was he a historical figure who united Egypt, or a mythic archetype? Even more intriguing are Manetho's numbers. His reign lengths for early kings stretch into centuries, leading some to dismiss him as a fabulist. But recent archaeology hints these weren't literal lifespans. They might have encoded overlapping reigns or symbolic timekeeping lost to later scribes. Without the original context, we're stuck interpreting a codex with half the cipher missing. The greatest tragedy lies in how Manetho's work was dismantled. Early Christians like Eusebius and Africanus Cherry picked his chronology to fit biblical narratives, discarding anything that didn't align. Byzantine scholars condensed his vivid narratives into dry king lists, stripping out the very details that made his history unique. And somewhere along the way, the master copy, the complete Egyptiocha as Manetho penned it, vanished, possibly rotting in some forgotten monastery cellar or burned as pagan heresy. Yet even in fragments, Manetho haunts Egyptology. His division of dynasties still structures textbooks, and his names for pharaohs often match cartouches found centuries later. That's the cruelest part, knowing how much he got right and how much more he could have told us. Those lost volumes might have been the key to aligning Egyptian records with Mesopotamia's, or proving links to sub-Saharan Africa hinted at in tomb paintings. Instead, we're left with echoes of a history that was never meant to be whispered, a story that once spanned papyrus scrolls, now reduced to footnotes in other men's books. The Epic of Gilgamesh we know today, the Babylonian version preserved in Ashurbanipal's library, is just the final draft of a story that had been evolving for centuries. Long before Sin-Leqi and Nini compiled his masterpiece, older, rawer versions of the tale were already circulating across Mesopotamia. etched onto tablets now shattered or lost. These earlier fragments aren't just rough sketches, they're windows into how one of humanity's first great myths took shape, revealing a Gilgamesh far darker and more ambiguous than the hero we've come to recognize. Take the Sumerian poems from the early 2nd millennium B.C., where Gilgamesh isn't yet the introspective wanderer of the Babylonian epic but a brutal king who rules with unchecked power. In Gilgamesh and Aga, he threatens to smash the skulls of his own citizens if they don't obey his war orders. Another fragment, Gilgamesh and the Cedar Forest, shows him and Enkidu slaughtering the demon Humbaba not as a noble quest but as a boastful trophy hunt, with the dying creature cursing them before its last breath. These versions lack the later epic's philosophical weight. Instead, they pulse with the raw energy of oral tradition, where heroes were flawed and violence wasn't glamorized but laid bare. The difference between these early accounts and the Babylonian revision is like comparing Homer's Achilles to the sanitized versions of Greek myth that came later. What's startling is how much theological evolution these fragments reveal. In the old Babylonian version from around 1800 B.C., the gods are capricious and cruel. Ishtar's wrath feels arbitrary, and Enkidu's death seems like divine spite rather than a lesson in mortality. Yet by the standard Babylonian epic, the narrative tightens into a meditation on human limits, with Gilgamesh's failures framed as spiritual growth. The earlier texts show us the messy workshop where these ideas were hammered out. One broken tablet from Nippur suggests Enkidu was originally a wild man sent by the gods to destroy Gilgamesh, not befriend him. Imagine how differently we'd read their bond if that version had prevailed. The most tantalizing gaps concern the flood narrative. The Babylonian epic famously includes Utnapishtim's story, borrowed from the Atrahasis myth, but earlier Sumerian fragments hint at alternate versions. A tablet from mentions Ziusudra, a different flood survivor, building his ark under different divine instructions. Another describes the deluge as localized to southern Mesopotamia rather than global, with gods arguing over whether humanity deserved punishment at all. These variants suggest the flood story wasn't yet fixed dogma but a flexible tradition, reshaped to fit local beliefs. Had more of these pre-Babylonian tablets survived, we might have traced how a regional tale became universal. Perhaps the greatest loss is what these early fragments could tell us about Mesopotamian society itself. The standard epic was polished for royal courts, but the rougher versions bubble with voices from the streets, complaints about oppressive rulers, dark humor about the futility of life, even what might be history's first recorded drinking song. A scrap from Lhasa shows Gilgamesh and Enkidu challenging each other to down pitchers of beer while villagers cheer. These aren't just literary differences, they're proof that the epic began as living folklore before scribes refined it into high art. The tragedy, we're left with a handful of broken tablets where there were once dozens. Some crumbled in buried archives, others were recycled as building material, their stories literally paved over by later generations. Each missing piece represents a fork in the epic's evolution we'll never explore. A Gilgamesh who might have been kinder or crueler, or whose quest ended not with resigned wisdom but defiance. The standard version is a masterpiece, but the ghosts of its predecessors whisper that there's always another story waiting just beneath the clay. The Sarmatian warriors didn't ride into battle with trumpets or drums. They carried something far more potent, the thundering rhythm of their own voices. Tacitus, ever the keen observer of Rome's adversaries, wrote briefly of these nomadic horsemen singing as they charged, their hymns rising like a storm from the steppes. But the actual words, the poetry that fueled their courage and bound their tribes together, have vanished like hoofprints in the wind. What we're missing isn't just verse, it's the heartbeat of a people who dominated the Eurasian plains for centuries, their identity woven into songs we'll never hear. Imagine what those battle hymns might have contained. The Sarmatians left no cities or written records, but archaeology paints a vivid picture. golden stag ornaments, swords forged for show as much as war, and graves where women were buried with bows alongside men. Their songs likely reflected this blend of artistry and ferocity. Later Ossetian folklore, descended from Sarmatian roots, hints at epic cycles where heroes rode winged steeds and communed with spirits of the sky. Tacitus's description of Sarmatian warriors singing of ancestral victories suggests these weren't just morale boosters, but living history's oral archives that traced lineage back to mythic founders. Without them, we've lost the Rosetta Stone to understanding how these nomads saw themselves, not as scattered clans, but as heirs to an unbroken warrior tradition. The loss cuts deeper when we consider how these hymns functioned. Roman accounts describe Sarmatians forming battle lines while chanting in unison, their voices harmonizing with the creak of saddles and the snorts of armored horses. This wasn't mere pageantry. Anthropologists note similar practices among Mongolian and Turkic tribes, where rhythmic singing coordinated complex cavalry maneuvers without shouted orders. A single hymn might have doubled as a tactical manual, its verses encoding formations or attack signals. Even more intriguing are hints of psychological warfare. Tacitus mentions enemy troops disoriented by the otherworldly sound of Sarmatian choruses, suggesting harmonic techniques lost to time. Were there deeper layers to these performances? Did certain pitches trigger fear responses or mimic the howls of wolves to unsettle foes? We'll never know. Most tragic is what the hymns could reveal about Sarmatian spirituality. Unlike the rigid pantheons of Mediterranean cultures, steppe religions often blurred the line between warrior and shaman. A surviving amulet bears an inscription, one of the few fragments of Sarmatian writing invoking a sky father and earth mother. Their hymns might have been prayers in disguise, calling down divine favor or channeling the spirits of fallen ancestors into living fighters. Later Alans, their cultural heirs, spoke of song weavers who could curse enemies with verses alone. This wasn't poetry as entertainment, it was incantation, a merging of art and sacred power. Their disappearance is a cultural crime, as the Sarmatians were absorbed by Goths, Huns, and eventually Slavic tribes. Their language faded, and with it, the oral traditions that sustained their identity. The hymns didn't burn in a library fire. They evaporated note by note with each generation that no longer had the words. What echoes remain survive in distorted forms, maybe a Ukrainian folk melody that spikes unexpectedly like a cavalry charge, or a Caucasian war dance where the footwork mirrors descriptions of Sarmatian rituals. These aren't just forgotten songs, they're the silenced voice of a people who once made the earth tremble with their verses, now reduced to a faint hum in the bloodlines of their descendants. The silence where those battle hymns once roared leaves us with a haunting question. How many other cultures vanished not with a bang, but with the last breath of the final person who remembered the old words? The Library of Pergamum wasn't just another collection of scrolls. It was Alexandria's fiercest rival, a treasure trove built to outshine even the Ptolemy's greatest pride. Pliny the Elder wrote of its grandeur, boasting over 200,000 volumes at its peak, each one a testament to the Attalid king's obsession with knowledge. But here's the tragedy. While we know Rome dismantled this marvel, repurposing its precious parchment for military dispatches and bureaucratic records, the libraries catalogue its master index of every text ever housed within those marble walls vanished without a trace. Without it, we're left guessing at the intellectual firepower Rome casually erased from history. Picture the scope of what might have lined those shelves. Pergamum specialized in medicine, thanks to its proximity to the healing sanctuary of Asclepius. Galen later hinted at medical texts so advanced they included surgical techniques for brain trauma and early theories of germ transmission, works that might have accelerated Western medicine by centuries if they'd survived. Even more tantalizing are references to Aristotle's Lost on Kingship, a treatise on governance said to have been commissioned by Alexander the Great himself. Pergamum's scholars reportedly annotated it with commentary comparing his ideals to real-world rulership, creating a dialogue across time that could have reshaped political philosophy. But the real loss lies in Pergamum's unique holdings texts Alexandria never possessed. Strabo mentions a geographical archive containing maps from Phoenician traders who'd circumnavigated Africa, complete with tidal charts and star coordinates. Another fragment from Pliny describes a botanical encyclopedia illustrated in color, detailing medicinal plants from as far away as India. These weren't just books, they were data repositories, the ancient equivalent of a search engine for the natural world. Rome's destruction of the library didn't just burn knowledge, it shattered an entire system for organizing and accessing it. The catalog's disappearance is especially heartbreaking because it held the key to reconstructing the library's holdings. Unlike Alexandria's scrolls, which were largely Greek translations, Pergamum prized originals, Babylonian astronomy tablets, Hittite treaties, even early Zoroastrian hymns transcribed onto parchment. A single surviving index entry might have revealed texts we didn't even know existed. Imagine discovering that the library housed an annotated copy of Berossus's Babylonica or a complete set of Thales works brought from Miletus. Instead, we're left with second-hand whispers like Plutarch's offhand remark about Pergamum's unusual collection of Persian dream interpretations. What makes this loss sting is how deliberately it happened. When Rome cut off Pergamum's papyrus supply in a petty trade war, the Attalids responded by perfecting parchment, a technology that revolutionized bookmaking. Yet after annexing the kingdom in 133 B.C., Rome treated the library not as a prize but as raw material. Scrolls were scraped clean for reuse, their ink washed away to make room for tax rolls and grain inventories. The catalogue, likely written on more durable vellum, might have survived this recycling had anyone recognized its value. But to Rome, knowledge was only as precious as the empire's immediate needs. The cruelest irony, Pergamum's catalogue may have held clues to saving Rome itself. Later historians like Ammianus Marcellinus speculated contained Etruscan prophecies about civic collapse, the same ones the Romans ignored until their own empire crumbled. The library didn't just lose its future when its index burned. It took with it warnings from the past that could have changed history. Now, its greatest works live only in footnotes, ghostly reminders of how much brilliance can vanish when power values utility over wisdom. From the ashes of Pergamum, another lost text beckons, one that didn't just record history but actively sought to rewrite it. The Sabines weren't just Rome's neighbors, they were the hidden architects of its soul. Before Romulus famously abducted their women to populate his new city, the Sabines practiced rituals so deeply woven into Rome's religious fabric that even the empire's greatest scholar, Varro, struggled to untangle which traditions were Roman and which were borrowed. He wrote extensively about these Sabine manuals in his Antiquities of Divine Matters, calling them the rootstock of Roman piety, yet not a single scroll survives. Their disappearance isn't just the loss of another ancient text, it's the silencing of a people who shaped Rome's relationship with the gods, then vanished from their own story. What made these manuals so transformative? Varro's fragments describe Sabine rites that became cornerstones of Roman worship. The Lupercalia, that wild February festival where naked priests smeared blood on spectators, originated as a Sabine purification ritual for shepherds. Even the sacred Ancilia shields, whose movement dictated whether Rome went to war, were said to be patterned after Sabine designs. But here's what's haunting. Varro hints these weren't just instructions for festivals. The manuals allegedly contained entire theological systems, explanations for why certain gods demanded animal sacrifice, while others accepted offerings of cheese and wine. Imagine discovering that Jupiter's thunderbolt or Mars's bloodlust weren't originally Roman concepts, but theological imports from hill tribes Rome later conquered. The real tragedy lies in how these texts could have explained cultural fusion. When Sabine families like the Claudii entered Rome's elite, they didn't abandon their gods, they folded them into the Roman pantheon. Varro mentions a Sabine goddess named Simonia who became intertwined with Ceres, and a war deity called Quirinus who evolved into Rome's deified Romulus. But without the original manuals, we can't trace how these mergers worked on the ground. Were there heated debates between priests about which rituals to keep? Did commoners resist new hybrid deities? A single surviving page might show us syncretism in action, the messy, human process of blending two spiritual worlds. Even more intriguing are the whispers of forbidden knowledge. Plutarch, citing Varro, describes Sabine priests using bronze mirrors to divine the future, a practice the early Romans adopted but later suppressed as foreign superstition. Another fragment references moonlit dances to honor Vacuna, a goddess of rest who had no direct Roman equivalent. These weren't quaint folk customs, they were sophisticated practices that might have represented an entire parallel religious tradition, one that viewed time, nature, and the divine through a lens fundamentally different from Rome's. Had the manuals survived, they could have revealed a spiritual landscape where gods weren't just patrons of cities, but forces tied to seasons, crops, and individual families. The cruelest irony, Rome's own success ensured these texts would vanish. As the empire expanded, it systematically absorbed and erased the identities of conquered peoples. Sabine rituals were preserved but stripped of context, repackaged as inherently Roman. By Varro's time, even educated elites struggled to distinguish which elements came from where. The manuals didn't burn in some catastrophic fire. They faded from memory through 1,000 small acts of cultural assimilation, their original language and meaning dissolving like ink in rain. What remains are ghosts' echoes in place names like the Quirinal Hill, once a Sabine stronghold, or in the peculiar persistence of spelt wheat in certain rites, a crop the Sabines prized. These fragments hint at a world where religion wasn't imposed from above but grew from the ground up, shaped by the very people Rome claimed to civilize. The loss of the Sabine manuals means we'll never fully understand how much of Rome's grandeur was borrowed, or how different its spiritual legacy might have been if it had listened more closely to those it conquered. The flames that consumed the Maya codices in Mani in 1562 didn't just burn bark, paper, and pigment, they erased entire worlds of knowledge. Bishop Diego de Landa, who orchestrated the auto da fe, later wrote of watching the demonic screenfolds curl into ash, unaware that he was destroying astronomical observations precise enough to track Venus's orbit and historical records stretching back centuries before Europe even knew the Americas existed. These weren't mere books, they were living databases of Mesoamerican science, philosophy, and timekeeping, their destruction leaving a void in human history that no later reconstruction could ever fill. Take the Dresden Codex, one of the 4 surviving Maya manuscripts. Its 78 pages contain mathematical tables predicting lunar eclipses with an accuracy Renaissance Europe couldn't match, alongside diagrams of the rainy seasons tied to celestial cycles. But here's what's devastating: colonial accounts describe dozens like it, each specialized. Some focused on medicinal herbs, mapping the properties of plants like chaca bark for fever relief or morning glory seeds used in sacred visions. Others, like the Lost Codex of Mayapon, allegedly chronicled dynastic marriages and wars across the Yucatan, offering a pre-colonial perspective on power, struggles the Spaniards only glimpsed through biased native informants. The scale of the loss becomes clear when you realize these weren't isolated texts, but nodes in an intellectual network. Libraries like the one at Mani reportedly held hundreds, their destruction ensuring we'll never grasp the full sophistication of Maya thought. The Zapotec codices suffered an equally catastrophic fate. Fragments preserved under church altars or repurposed as painting canvases hint at narratives vastly different from Spanish chronicles. The Codex Zouch Nuttall, likely smuggled to Europe early, depicts the ruler 8-deer jaguar claw's 11th century conquests not as mere battles, but as cosmic events tied to the movements of the planet Mars. Imagine what similar texts might have revealed, perhaps a Zapotec historiography where human actions and celestial phenomena were inseparable. Missionaries burned these because they saw idolatry, but what they actually destroyed was evidence of a world where science and spirituality weren't opposing forces, but intertwined lenses for understanding existence. What makes this cultural erasure especially cruel is how deliberately targeted it was. Indigenous scribes continued producing hybrid codices secretly, embedding old knowledge beneath Christian imagery. The Codex Mendoza, created for Spanish officials, carefully lists tribute payments in gold and jade, but earlier originals might have tracked more than material wealth. A Nahuatl noble's letter mentions a stolen codex recording the songs of the ancestors, suggesting some contained not just data, but the lyrical heart of stolen civilizations. The few codices that survived did so through sheer luck, hidden in caves, gifted to curious collectors, or mislabeled as pagan curiosities in European libraries. Their fragments tease us with possibilities. A single page from the Paris Codex shows zodiac-like constellations unrecognizable to Western astronomy, while the Grolier Codex's Venus tables confirm the Maya tracked the planet cycles with a precision unmatched until modern telescopes. Each one is a shattered mirror reflecting a lost intellectual universe, one where history wasn't linear but cyclical, where gods weren't distant judges but forces woven into the fabric of mathematics itself. The burning of the codices didn't just rob the Maya and Zapotec of their past, it robbed humanity of alternate ways to comprehend time, space, and our place within them. We're left with echoes, a glyph here, a colonial era redrawing there, like trying to reconstruct an epic symphony from a handful of stray notes. The tragedy isn't just what we know was lost, but all the wonders we'll never realize existed in the first place. Turning from the ashes of Mesoamerica's written memory, another vanished text whispers from across the Atlantic, one that held secrets not of stars and kings, but of life's very building blocks. Strabo's Geographica tantalizingly mentions a set of royal chronicles from Greco-Bactria, that extraordinary kingdom where Greek colonists fused with Central Asian traditions to create a civilization as dazzling as it was short-lived. These lost annals, likely penned by court historians of kings like Thutmose and Menander, could have been our Rosetta Stone for understanding how Alexander's legacy played out on the very edge of the known world. Instead, we're left with fragments and rumors, grasping at clues about a realm where Dionysian revelry met Zoroastrian fire altars, and where Greek-style theaters hosted performances for audiences who also venerated the Buddha. Consider what these chronicles might have contained. Greco-Bactria sat at the crossroads of empires, trading silk with Han China and battling nomadic horsemen from the steppes. A single surviving line from Strabo references King Eucratides waging many wars, but the original texts likely detailed diplomacy and cultural exchange far beyond military campaigns. Imagine reading first-hand accounts of Greek artisans teaching marble sculpture to Parthian apprentices, or Bactrian interpreters bridging conversations between Indian philosophers and Stoic scholars. These weren't just records, they were witness statements to one of history's most audacious experiments in cultural fusion. The blur between myth and fact makes this loss especially painful. Later Buddhist texts like the Milinda Panha depict King Menander as a philosopher king debating metaphysics with monks, while Chinese chronicles call him the invader with the golden armor. The Bactrian chronicles could have resolved these contradictions, showing us whether Menander truly converted to Buddhism or simply patronized it as political strategy. Even more intriguing are numismatic clues coins that blend Zeus with local sun deities, or show kings wearing elephant crowns alongside Greek diadems. Written explanations for these syncretic choices likely existed in those vanished scrolls, decoding visual symbolism we can now only guess at. What's equally fascinating is how these texts might have reshaped our view of Hellenistic governance. Greco-Bactrian rulers issued proclamations in both Greek and Prakrit, suggesting sophisticated multilingual administration. A single line preserved by Justin mentions King Demetrius crossing the Hindu Kush to conquer new lands, but the original chronicles probably outline the logistical nightmares of supplying Greek phalanxes in the Indus Valley. Did they recruit local mercenaries, adapt siege tactics to mountain fortresses? The answers perished with the texts, leaving modern historians to reconstruct supply chains from scattered arrowheads and rusted belt buckles. The greatest tragedy lies in how these chronicles disappeared. Unlike Alexandria's library, which fell to a single catastrophic fire, Greco-Bactria's records likely faded piecemeal, abandoned in monsoon-flooded palaces, repurposed as wrapping for caravan goods, or deliberately destroyed by later Kushan conquerors. A handful of Greek-inscribed pottery shards and petroglyphs hint at a vibrant literary culture, but the master narratives are gone. Occasionally, archaeology taunts us. A fragmentary parchment found in Ai Khanoum references the king's victories in the eastern valleys, but the rest crumbled to dust upon excavation. These lost chronicles represent more than forgotten history. They're missing chapters in the story of globalization itself. Greco-Bactria was the first place where East and West didn't just clash, but intermarried, traded ideas, and redefined each other. Their historians surely noticed this, recording moments of synthesis we can scarcely imagine. Without their voices, we're left with a half-told tale where Greek columns stand silently in Afghan deserts, their original meaning as elusive as the parchment that once explained them. Long before Hesiod's Theogony laid out the orderly genealogy of Greek gods, another version of creation pulsed through the shadows, one far stranger, more mystical, and tantalizingly incomplete. The Orphic Theogonies, attributed to the legendary poet-musician Orpheus, presented a cosmos born not from chaos alone, but from a shimmering cosmic egg hatched by a serpentine deity named Phanes, the bringer of light. This wasn't just an alternate myth. It was a radical reimagining of divinity itself, where gods emerged from primordial darkness through a series of transformations so esoteric that even ancient philosophers debated their meaning. Unlike Hesiod's clear familial tree, the Orphic fragments suggest a universe where identity was fluid, where Zeus swallows Phanes to absorb his power, where Dionysus is dismembered and reborn, and where the soul's journey mirrors the god's own cycles of destruction and renewal. What makes these fragments so electrifying is how they subvert every assumption about Greek religion. In Hesiod's version, the world begins with chaos, Gaia, and Eros, a straightforward, almost bureaucratic progression. But the Orphic hymns, preserved on scraps of gold foil buried with initiates, describe a primal unity called Anank necessity, coiling around the egg of creation with her consort Chronos time, their embrace setting the universe in motion. Phanes, the first god, is both male and female, his body adorned with animal heads and golden wings, a far cry from the human-shaped Olympians. This wasn't mythology as civic ritual, it was theology as psychedelic revelation, a vision of divinity as something fractured, paradoxical, and endlessly self-reinventing. The Orphic creation myths also introduced something startlingly absent in Hesiod, a preoccupation with the soul's fate. One fragment describes humanity arising from the ashes of the Titans, who devoured the infant Dionysus, making us part divine, part monstrous. Another speaks of souls cycling through reincarnation until purified, a concept alien to mainstream Greek thought but echoing Eastern philosophies. Had the full text survived, they might have shown us a Hellenic world far more interconnected with Indo-European mysticism than we ever suspected. Instead, we're left piecing together a puzzle where half the pieces are missing, forcing scholars to debate whether Orphism was a radical sect or the submerged iceberg of Greek religion's deeper, darker roots. The greatest enigma is how much was deliberately concealed. Orphic teachings were reportedly shared only with initiates, written in coded language to shield secrets from the unworthy. Later Neoplatonists like Proclus quote passages describing Zeus as the beginning, middle, and end, suggesting a monotheistic undercurrent foreign to Hesiod's polytheism. Even the fragments we have scratched onto burial tablets in southern Italy or quoted by Christian apologists feel like whispers of a much grander narrative. Imagine discovering that the Greek gods were merely masks for a single, ineffable force, and that the Orphics knew it all along. What's endlessly frustrating is how these mysteries might have been solved if just one complete scroll had survived. The Theogony papyrus, charred but partially legible, offers glimpses a commentary on an Orphic hymn that treats the myth as allegory, with gods representing elements and cosmic principles. But the original hymn it analyzes is lost, leaving us with a decoder ring but no message. This incompleteness fuels wild theories that Orphism influenced Pythagorean numerology, that early Christianity borrowed its resurrection motifs, or that its vision of a suffering God foreshadowed Gnosticism. Without the full texts, we'll never know if these connections are profound or mere coincidence. The Orphic Theogonies haunt us because they represent a road not taken, a version of Greek spirituality that valued inner transformation over civic duty, that saw the divine as something to be experienced rather than merely appeased. Hesiod's gods rule from Olympus, Orpheus's dance in the spaces between atoms. Their fragments remind us that history preserves what suits the victors, and that the most revolutionary ideas often flicker out, leaving only enough light to make us wonder what else has been lost to time's silent conspirators. The Nubian king list should have been the definitive record of Kushite glory, a dynasty that didn't just conquer Egypt but ruled it as the 25th dynasty, bringing a renaissance of art, architecture, and piety to the Nile Valley. Yet for all their monumental achievements, the annals of these black pharaohs remain shrouded in silence. Egyptian inscriptions taunt us with passing references, a tribute list here, a temple dedication there hinting at comprehensive chronicles kept in the Kushite heartland of Napata and Meroe. But not a single intact Nubian king list survives, leaving historians to piece together a fragmented puzzle where half the pieces are missing. Consider the stakes of this loss. The Kushite rulers Paenki, Shabaka, Taharqa weren't just copying Egyptian traditions, they were curating their own. A broken stele from Jebel Barkal mentions a royal archive where scribes recorded everything from military campaigns to theological debates, written in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and the still undeciphered Meroitic script. Imagine uncovering a scroll where Taharqa explains why he chose to rebuild temples in Thebes, or how his sister, the god's wife of Ammon, wielded priestly power unseen since Hatshepsut's reign. Instead, we rely on biased Egyptian accounts that oscillate between grudging respect and outright dismissal, reducing a rival civilization's history to footnotes in someone else's story. The gaps are most agonizing when it comes to chronology. Egyptian records list Kushite kings as if they appeared fully formed, with no context for their rise. A single reference in the Karnak inscriptions alludes to a King Alaura, the supposed unifier of Upper Nubia, but his reign dates could vary by decades depending on interpretation. Without Nubia's own annals, we can't confirm whether Paenki's invasion of Egypt in 748 B.C. was a sudden strike or the climax of generations of planning. Even more frustrating are the later rulers' names like Ammoninatakilupt or Ammonianus survive only on weathered stelae, their achievements reduced to vague epithets like the lion who terrified Rome. What makes this absence especially bitter is the evidence of what once existed. The temple at Kawa yielded fragments of a papyrus mentioning a house of life like Egypt's, where Kushite scholars compiled king lists intertwined with celestial events. One tantalizing scrap describes a coronation timed to the rising of Sirius, mirroring Egyptian practice but with distinct Nubian rituals, perhaps involving the sacred rams of Ammon worshipped at Napata. Archaeologists have found empty alcoves in Maras palaces that likely held scrolls, their contents long since crumbled in the humidity or burned during raids. The greatest irony, Nubia's rivals meticulously documented their encounters with Kush, but always through a distorting lens. Assyrian annals boast of driving Taharqa from Memphis, yet omit how he regrouped and held the south for years. Greek historians like Herodotus vaguely mention Ethiopian kings who sent tribute to Persia, but their accounts are riddled with exoticism. Without Nubia's own voice, we're left with a history written by everyone except the people who lived it, a chorus of outsiders drowning out the central narrative. Occasionally, archaeology offers glimmers of what's lost. A recently discovered mural in Danjel shows a Kushite queen smiting enemies in a scene straight from Egyptian iconography, but with her wearing a distinctly Nubian crown. It's a silent testament to a civilization that refused to be a mere echo of its northern neighbor. The missing annals might have shown us how Kushite rulers negotiated their dual identity, pharaohs to their Egyptian subjects, but something far older and prouder to their own people. Until those texts resurface, we're left with half a story, forever wondering how Africa's most enduring kingdom saw itself, and why it chose to let so much of its memory fade into silence. The Illyrian sea raiders didn't just attack ships, they mastered the art of vanishing. Ancient historian Appian drops tantalizing hints about their logs, meticulous records of raids that once turned the Adriatic into their personal hunting ground. These weren't mere lists of plundered cargo, they were navigational chess moves detailing how Illyrian captains exploited hidden coves, seasonal currents, and the blind spots of Roman patrols. Yet not a single log survives, leaving us to wonder how a people so feared by merchants from Corinth to Sicily left so little trace of their own story. Imagine what those logs could have revealed. Appian describes Illyrian ships light, fast lemboi ambushing vessels at the narrowest straits, where winds and tides gave them an edge. One fragmented account mentions a pirate queen named Tutor, who allegedly kept records of tolls extracted from coastal towns, treating piracy like a state-sanctioned industry. Were these logs merely tactical, or did they contain something far more sophisticated, perhaps coded maps of underwater caves where loot was stored, or alliances with inland tribes who supplied intelligence? Roman consuls complained of raids timed suspiciously after grain shipments left Egypt, suggesting the Illyrians didn't just stumble upon targets, they planned. They watched, and somewhere they wrote it all down. The loss of these records doesn't just obscure pirate tactics, it erases an entire shadow economy. The Adriatic wasn't just a battleground, it was a bustling black market where Illyrian middlemen traded stolen Greek bronze for Celtic amber and Sicilian wheat for Balkan silver. Strabo alludes to treaty tablets between raiders and coastal settlements, hinting at protection rackets disguised as diplomacy. Without the original logs, we can't untangle this web. Did pirates demand tribute in kind or in intelligence about richer targets? Were some merchants secretly complicit, paying for safe passage while rivals were plundered? The Romans, who eventually crushed the Illyrians, had every reason to burn such damning evidence. What makes this silence especially frustrating is the geopolitical ripple effect. Illyrian raids were the pretext for Rome's first major naval expansion in 229 B.C. Polybius claims the Senate was shown intercepted logs proving Tutor's captains had attacked Italian allies, but the originals vanished after the war. Were these documents exaggerated to justify conquest, or did they expose uncomfortable truths? That Rome's rescue of Greek cities was really a power grab cloaked in anti-piracy rhetoric. The logs might have revealed whether Illyrians were mere brigands or savvy players in a wider game, manipulating tensions between Rome and Macedon. The greatest tragedy isn't the missing battle accounts, it's the lost human voices. A single surviving phrase from Appian describes a captured log entry boasting of a raid so audacious, the gods themselves paused to watch. Who wrote those words? A battle-scarred captain, a scribe forced into service. The Illyrians left no grand monuments, but their logs were their epic poems, written in stolen ink on fragile parchment, celebrating victories that history would later paint as crimes. Their disappearance means we'll never hear their side, only the roar of Roman propaganda drowning out the whispers of the sea. The bustling markets of Sardis didn't just trade in gold and textiles, they dealt in secrets. Herodotus, ever the keen observer of economic quirks, drops a tantalizing hint about Lydian trade contracts that governed commerce across Anatolia, calling them binding as the cords of Midas. Yet these intricate agreements, which might have revealed how the world's first coinage system functioned in practice, have crumbled to dust. What we're left with are second-hand descriptions of a mercantile legal framework so advanced, it makes modern business deals look simplistic by comparison. Picture the scene: Sardis, the Lydian capital, where gold-rich merchants from Babylon haggled with Greek colonists over wool dyed in Tyrian purple. The contracts Herodotus mentions weren't just receipts. They were multi-clause masterpieces, specifying everything from interest rates on silver loans to penalties for counterfeit electrum coins. One fragmentary account describes a dispute resolution clause requiring traders to swear oaths before the temple of Cybele, with false testimony punishable by exile. Another references standardized weights and measures certified by royal seals, suggesting a level of economic centralization unmatched in the ancient world outside Egypt. These weren't mere handshake deals, they were the scaffolding of an entire financial ecosystem. The real tragedy lies in what these contracts could have taught us about early globalization. Lydia sat at the crossroads of empires where Assyrian accounting met Ionian maritime law. Later Greek writers like Xenophon hint that Lydian agreements incorporated elements from as far away as Phoenicia, perhaps early versions of maritime insurance or bills of lading. Imagine uncovering a contract that detailed how Sardis merchants financed cargo ships venturing to Tartessos in Spain, or how they mitigated risks when caravans crossed bandit-infested mountain passes. Without these documents, we're left guessing at the sophistication of Bronze Age supply chains, forced to reconstruct them from scattered pottery shards and ambiguous customs records. What makes their disappearance especially frustrating is the light they could have shed on social mobility. Lydia was famously the birthplace of coinage, but Herodotus suggests their contracts also facilitated something radical: credit systems allowing enterprising commoners to rise beyond their station. One cryptic passage mentions a sealed tablet, enabling a former slave to amass wealth through textile trades, an ancient equivalent of venture capital that challenges our assumptions about rigid class structures. Were these contracts tools of empowerment, or did they reinforce elite monopolies? The answer likely lay in the fine print of agreements now lost, where interest rates and repayment terms could reveal whether Lydia's famed wealth trickled down or pooled at the top. Perhaps the greatest mystery surrounds the contract's role in Lydia's downfall. When Croesus faced Cyrus's Persian armies, was his defeat partly due to unraveling trade networks? Later historians mention Persian satraps meticulously preserving Babylonian business records, yet the Lydian archives seemingly vanished overnight. Some scholars speculate the contracts contained proprietary minting techniques, secrets the conquering Persians either destroyed or appropriated. Others believe they documented alliances with Greek city-states that abandoned Lydia in its hour of need. Either way, their absence leaves us with a financial whodunit. How much of history's first economic powerhouse was undone not by spears but by broken promises and unpaid debts? The irony is palpable. The Lydians invented money as a universal measure of value, yet their own commercial wisdom, carefully inscribed on clay tablets and papyrus, proved far less durable than the coins they minted. Those vanished contracts might have shown us how deeply commerce shaped diplomacy, how trust was quantified before credit scores existed, or how a kingdom's wealth could evaporate when ink faded and seals cracked. Instead, we're left with echoes in Herodotus's anecdotes and the faint impressions of styluses on long-lost wax tablets, whispering of deals struck and fortunes lost in the markets of Sardis. The Numidian royal archives weren't just administrative records, they were the heartbeat of North Africa's most powerful Berber kingdom, a treasure trove that could have rewritten our understanding of Rome's rise from the perspective of its most cunning ally. Sallust, the Roman historian who chronicled Jugurtha's war, drops tantalizing hints about these scrolls, describing them as meticulously kept by King Masiniss's scribes in the capital of Sirta. Imagine discovering a first-hand account of how a Berber warlord turned his nomadic tribes into a unified kingdom strong enough to sway Rome's fate, only to realize those documents crumbled to dust centuries ago. Their disappearance isn't just the loss of another ancient library, it's the silencing of Africa's voice in its own historical narrative. Consider what these archives might have contained. Masinissa wasn't just a client king. He was a master strategist who played Rome and Carthage against each other for decades. Sallust implies the archives held detailed treaties, including secret clauses where Rome promised Numidian sovereignty over lands Carthage considered its own. One fragment mentions a letter from Scipio Africanus addressing Masinissa as brother, a shocking intimacy between a Roman general and a barbarian ruler. The archives likely revealed how Masinissa leveraged this relationship, perhaps showing Rome's early reliance on Berber cavalry, the very troops that later turned the tide at Zama. Without these records, we're left with Rome's sanitized version of events, where Numidia appears as a grateful vassal rather than a shrewd power broker. The real tragedy lies in the cultural insights we've lost. Masinissa's reign marked a golden age of syncretism, where Punic, Berber, and Hellenistic traditions fused into something uniquely Numidian. Later Roman writers sneered at Sirta's half-civilized palaces, but the archives could have shown us the deliberate artistry behind this blend. Were there debates over adopting Carthaginian irrigation techniques, records of Berber poets adapting Greek meters to sing praises into Tamazight, even the kingdom's famed horsemanship, the backbone of Numidian military, might have been documented in training manuals now lost. These weren't just dusty scrolls, they were the DNA of a civilization that shaped North Africa's identity long before Arab or Ottoman influences arrived. Equally heartbreaking is how their absence distorts our view of resistance. When Jugurtha, Masinissa's grandson, defied Rome, Sallust claims he roused his followers by reading from the royal archives, proof of broken Roman promises. But what exactly did those parchments say? The original treaties could have revealed whether Jugurtha's revolt was truly a betrayal, as Rome claimed, or a justified rebellion against imperial overreach. Later Berber revolts under Tacfarinas suggest a pattern of resistance rooted in unfulfilled pledges. The archives might have been the smoking gun, documenting generations of diplomatic duplicity that textbooks now gloss over. The cruelest irony, we know how they were lost. When Rome finally crushed Jugurtha in 106 BC, Sirta's libraries were systematically purged. Surviving documents were hauled off to Roman archives, where they likely languished unread before crumbling or being recycled. A few may have survived long enough for later historians like Plutarch to glimpse them. His mention of Numidian land grants to Italian merchants hints at unseen sources, but the bulk vanished, taking with them the chance to hear Masinissa's kingdom speak in its own words. What remains are fragments and echoes. A mosaic in Algeria's Churchill Museum shows a Berber scribe recording a victory, perhaps a copied scene from some lost chronicle. The Tifinagh script still used by Tuaregs carries faint whispers of the bureaucracy that once governed from Sirta. But the archives themselves are ghosts, their absence a gaping hole where North Africa's first great indigenous state should stand in full clarity. Without them, Numidia remains forever in Rome's shadow, a supporting character in someone else's epic, denied the chance to tell its own story. The Chinese chronicles describe a land shrouded in mist and mystery, a kingdom called Yamatai, ruled by a shaman queen named Himiko who communed with spirits and commanded the loyalty of 100 tribes. These records, chiefly the Weizhai from 3rd century China, offer our only written glimpse into Japan's shadowy pre-imperial past. But here's the catch: Yamatai's location remains one of history's most heated debates, and the Weizhai isn't just a historical account, it's a labyrinth of contradictions that scholars have been trying to navigate for centuries. Picture the scene: Chinese envoys arriving in a land of towering wooden palisades, where subjects prostrated themselves before a queen who governed from behind silken curtains. The Weizhai claims Himiko wielded power through sorcery rather than soldiers, maintaining peace for decades while neighboring warlords tore each other apart. She sent tribute to the Chinese court mirrors and slaves, in exchange for recognition as the rightful ruler of Wa, their name for Japan. But the text also drops baffling details. Yamatai lay a 12-month voyage southeast from Korea, yet later passages describe distances that suggest it might have been in northern Kyushu or even the Kinai region near modern Nara. These inconsistencies turn what should be a straightforward account into a historian's nightmare. What makes these records so controversial isn't just their ambiguity, it's what they imply about Japan's origins. If Yamatai was in Kyushu, as some archaeologists argue, then the Yamato clan's rise to power centuries later might have involved the violent absorption of Himiko's legacy. But if Yamatai was already in the Kinai heartland, as others insist, the Yamato rulers could have been her direct successors, repackaging her spiritual authority to cement their own. The Weizhai mentions a civil war after Himiko's death, with her male relatives vying for control before a teenage girl, Io, was chosen to succeed her. This single passage raises staggering questions. Was Japan's imperial system born from a matriarchal theocracy? Did early Shinto's priestesses inherit power from Himiko's tradition? The chronicles dangle these possibilities before us, only to leave the answers buried under centuries of speculation. The stakes of this debate become clear when you examine the artifacts. Chinese bronze mirrors bearing the inscription Queen of Wa have been found in both Kyushu and the Kinai region, fueling arguments on both sides. Proponents of the Kyushu theory point to massive 3rd century burial mounds there, matching the Weizhai's description of Himiko's 1,000-attendant funeral. But Kinai advocates counter with evidence of early centralized governance near Mount Miwa, where later emperors claimed divine descent. The irony is painful. The very records that could settle this debate are the ones obscuring it, their measurements and place names rendered useless by time's erosion. Perhaps the greatest tragedy lies in what the Weizhai leaves unsaid. It describes Yamatai's society in terms the Chinese understood: hierarchical, tribute-based, but glosses over the spiritual practices that made Himiko's rule possible. Later Japanese texts like the Kojiki sanitize her legacy, turning a powerful sorceress queen into a vague, ancestral figure. The truth might be hiding in plain sight. Recent excavations of Yoshinagari in Soga Prefecture reveal a fortified settlement with watchtowers and ritual pits eerily matching the Weizhai's account. But without corroborating texts, we're left guessing whether this was Yamatai itself or just one of its vassal states. The Yamatai records haunt us because they represent history's cruelest tease, a detailed portrait of a civilization that refuses to reveal its address. Every archaeological find, from ceremonial swords to oracle bones, adds another brushstroke to the picture, but the full canvas remains maddeningly out of reach. The Weizhai gives us Queen Himiko, her shadow stretching across the centuries, daring us to separate fact from legend if only we could figure out where to dig. From the Sibylline books that guided Rome through existential crises to the Nubian king, lists that could rewrite Africa's ancient history, these 30 lost documents represent more than just missing texts. They're gaping holes in humanity's collective memory. Each disappearance has left us with a fractured timeline, forcing historians to reconstruct civilizations using only scattered fragments and second-hand accounts. Think of the Bronze Tablets of Sparta, which might have revealed the brutal realities behind history's most infamous warrior culture, or the Phoenicians' Maritime Logs that could prove they charted oceans far beyond the Mediterranean. Even personal accounts like Thutmose III's detailed battle journals or Cleopatra's diplomatic letters would have given us unfiltered access to the minds that shaped empires. The collective impact of these losses is staggering. Without Manetho's original Egyptian history, we struggle to align Pharaoh's reigns with biblical events. The absence of the pre-Homeric Odyssey leaves us guessing how Greek myths evolved before they were polished for aristocratic audiences. And the burning of Maya codices didn't just erase records, it severed our connection to an entire hemisphere's scientific and spiritual wisdom. These gaps don't just obscure facts, they distort how we perceive cultural evolution, making ancient societies seem simpler or more monolithic than they truly were. Imagine trying to understand the modern world if all we had were a handful of newspaper headlines and a few pages torn from random textbooks. That's the challenge historians face every day. Yet there's hope in the shadows. Every decade, archaeologists unearth surprises like the Theogony papyrus with its Orphic secrets or the Dead Sea Scrolls that revolutionized biblical studies. Who's to say the original Sibylline books aren't buried in a Roman sewer, or that a cache of Ashoka's edicts won't surface in a Himalayan monastery? The past has a way of resurfacing when we least expect it. So here's where you come in. If you could recover one of these lost documents, which would it be? The Etruscan library rituals to hear Rome's spiritual mentors in their own words. The complete epic of Gilgamesh to witness humanity's first hero story in all its uncensored glory. Drop your pick in the comments and let's keep the conversation alive. And if you're hungry for more mysteries from the cracks of history, hit subscribe because the next discovery might be just one excavation away, and you won't want to miss it when it surfaces.